You're still awake? That's all right. You're safe here. You found your way to the Lady Mythos. Here, we don't rush, we listen to stories the world buried deep, to women turned into monsters, to truths that have waited too long. Before you get sleepy, if there's a story you like to hear, or a place you're listening from, I'd love to know. Leave a comment anytime. It helps me imagine the little circle we're all sitting in, even if we're all in different corners of the world. You, me, and the myths between us. Tonight, I want to tell you about Medusa. Chapter 1: The Girl in the Temple. If we're going to talk about Medusa, it helps to sit for a moment in the kind of world that made her story make sense. Not a fantasy world, a very real ancient world where people looked at the sea and thought of a god, walked into a stone building and felt watched, and didn't separate religion from daily life the way we often do now. Picture a coastline, somewhere in the Greek world, not a postcard beach, just a working shore, pebbles underfoot, small boats pulled above the tide line, nets drying on stakes. The air smells like salt, fish, olive oil, and smoke from cooking fires. This is the same world that told Medusa's story. People here live close to the elements. They're grateful when the sea is calm. They're scared when it isn't. So they speak about the sea as if it has moods, because to them it does. That's how Poseidon feels present, not as a cartoon figure, but as the temper of the water they depend on. If you walk inland from the shore, you'll find a temple. It's not a palace where people live. It's a house for a god. You would reach it by a dusty path, climbing a little rise so it stands above the town. Temples were placed where people could see them, on a hill, at the harbor, or at the center of a settlement, because they were markers of protection and identity. The whole community helped maintain them. Farmers contributed grain, potters made votive cups, fishermen brought a portion of the catch, and the wealthy funded roof repairs or a new statue base when the old one cracked. Inside, the floor is cool stone. The space feels open and simple, not crowded with benches. People didn't sit through services the way we might imagine. You'd see columns, a cellar, the main room, and depending on the temple, an image of the deity. In a sanctuary of Athena, you'd expect a statue with a helmet, maybe a spear or a shield. The shield is important. The Greeks often set a Gorgon face, a Gorgonion, on shields and doorways. Early versions looked fierce, wide eyes, fangs, even a tongue sticking out. It wasn't meant as horror for its own sake. It was protective. The idea was simple. An ugly, fearsome face frightens of harm, like putting a watchdog on your gate or a lucky symbol above a door. Medusa's name eventually becomes attached to that face, but in the beginning, when artists painted vases in the archaic period, they weren't painting a single tragic woman. They were painting a type, the Gorgon as a ward against danger. Only later do poets and storytellers pull one of those figures forward, give her a personal history, and call her Medusa, mortal, different from her immortal sisters. The poet, Hesiod, mentions her among the Gorgons. Later, the Roman poet Ovid tells a more detailed story about how she changed and why. We'll walk through both perspectives as we go, because they shape how people think of her even now. Before we go further, a small side note about what purity meant in a temple. It wasn't about moral perfection, it was practical and ritual. If someone had touched a dead body, they were ritually unclean for a time. If someone had just given birth, there were days when they stayed away before returning to public worship. People washed hands, burned incense, changed garments, and followed rules that kept sacred spaces orderly. For a priestess serving at an altar, those rules were strict. Vows mattered. The temple belonged to the goddess, and the people who served there were expected to keep the place worthy of her presence. Now, hold that world in your mind and add one more layer: travel. The Greek world wasn't a single country. It was a web of city-states and colonies scattered around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Sailors carried grain, wine, olive oil, and stories. A tale about a hero in one port might pick up a new detail in the next. A sculptor would copy a good idea he saw in another town. Over time, this movement is how myths deepen and change. It's why you'll sometimes hear different versions of the same scene. In one place, a god is gentle. In another, the same god is harsh. The variations don't cancel each other out. They show how alive the stories were. So when you hear Medusa, know that we're not pining down a single official biography. We're entering a tradition with layers. The earliest layers gives us Gorgons as guardians and monsters, a kind of shorthand for danger repelled. Another layer makes one Gorgon mortal, which is unusual and meaningful. A mortal can suffer and die. That makes her more like us. A later layer brings in a specific temple, a violation and a transformation. It focuses the story on harm and blame. And still later, artists and thinkers start asking what her face means, why it frightens, why it protects, and why it keeps showing up on shields and buildings for centuries. Let's go back to the temple for a moment, because this is the kind of place where Medusa's life turns. Imagine arriving just before dawn. The sky is lightening. You can hear sandals on stone. Someone sweeping the floor. Oil lamps are being checked and lit. A careful task because a smoky wick ruins the smell and stings the eye. The caretaker or priestess moves through the space in a practiced way. Lamps, altar, doorway, offerings. People come with small things to leave. A clay figurine, a lock of hair, a ribbon, a cup. Ordinary objects made sacred by intention. In a sanctuary of Athena, the atmosphere would be firm rather than soft. Athena stands for skill, strategy, and civic order. She isn't the goddess of random storm winds or wild passions. She is the one who keeps a city functioning. Law courts, crafts, planned defense. When a city is the home of a goddess like that, the people want her attention and her favor. Being chosen to serve in her house would be an honor for a mortal. It meant living inside the rhythm of ritual, learning the rules, keeping yourself ready, and giving your time to the goddess. You can see how a story might begin there. A young woman, dedicated to service, caught at the point where divine order and human behavior collide. The ancients were honest about this tension. Gods were powerful, but not always fair. Humans made vows and sometimes broke them. A temple was a boundary between what should be and what is. When harm happens on sacred ground, it doesn't fit. Myths step in to explain this mismatch, sometimes by assigning blame, sometimes by turning the injured person into a warning sign, sometimes by turning a face into a shield that looks back. Another small side note, from the world of objects rather than words. Archaeologists have found Gorgon faces on all kinds of things: pottery, roof tiles, shield bosses, even furniture fittings. The consistency tells you the symbol worked for people. They believed a strong, staring face at the threshold could keep trouble out. You can see these faces change over the centuries. Early ones are wide and animal-like. Later ones become more human and even beautiful, especially in classical and Hellenistic art. That shift matters for Medusa. It's the move from monster to woman, from pure simple to a person with a story. Think of art and story talking to each other. A potter paints a terrifying Gorgon to guard a wine jar. A poet sees that and makes the stare a power. The power to turn a person to a stone if they meet the gaze. A sculptor later decides to carve a Gorgon who is not ugly at all, but striking and cool. And now the poet can say, she was once beautiful, and that beauty was part of the problem in a world where gods take what they want. Step by step, a mask becomes a person, the person becomes Medusa. There's one more piece of world building we should set gently in place. How heroes fit into all of this. When someone says Perseus, you might think of a clean, simple quest. A young hero sent to slay a monster. But in the older way of telling, a hero isn't only brave. He's also a person used by the gods to settle divine scores, test boundaries, and move power around. Heroes get gifts: a mirror bright shield, winged sandals, a blade, because their success reflects back on the god who gave the tool. When Perseus enters Medusa's story later, he doesn't walk in alone. He walks in as the tip of a divine arrangement, carrying the equipment of other powers. That's not an excuse for what happens. It's part of the older logic. Mortals often act out plans bigger than themselves. All of this is to say, Medusa's story grows from a world where symbols are practical, temples are busy, gods are present and imperfect, and images travel from one object to another until they pick up lives of their own. She isn't born as a figure with snakes for hair and a stare that freezes. She becomes that in the telling, shaped by poets, by sculptures, by shields held up in sunlight, by doorways guarded, by mothers tying amulets on their children, and by sailors who want safe water under their boats. When you keep that in mind, you can listen with more sympathy. It stops being only a tale about a monster to defeat and turns into a story about how harm, power, and protection get tangled. So for tonight, keep the picture simple and clear. A coastline, a town, a temple on a rise, where the air is a little cooler. A community that believes its goddess watches and helps. A symbol, the Gorgon face, meant to keep bad things away. And somewhere inside that picture, a mortal girl whose name will outlast marble and bronze. Not because she wanted fame, but because people needed a face for fear and a face for safety, and they put both on the same person. In the next chapter, we'll let the texts speak directly. We'll meet the Gorgon sisters in the older lists, and we'll hear how one of them, the mortal one, is set apart. We'll keep the explanations clear and plain, bring in the objects that archaeologists actually find, and then follow the path that leads from a temple's rules to a life overturned. But for now, hold on to the scene. A quiet building of stone, the smell of oil and smoke, a shield with a face that watches the door, and a world where the gods are always near enough to touch. Chapter 2: Origins in Myth. If we follow the oldest surviving threads of Medusa's story, we have to step into the voice of a poet who lived about 27 centuries ago, Hesiod. His poem, Theogony, is like a family tree of gods, monsters, and legendary figures. A way to place them in relation to one another and to the creation of the world. It's not told in the dramatic style of a play, but as a long list that still manages to suggest character and mood. In Hesiod's telling, the Gorgons are already there, and they're not alone. They are children of Phocis and Seta, two ancient sea deities. That already places them in a certain category. The sea in Greek thought was both life-giving and dangerous. It could be the road to trade and new lands, but it could also swallow you without warning. So many of the beings connected to the sea in mythology have a double nature, helpful if approached properly, destructive if not. The Gorgon sisters are named Sthena, Uriel, and Medusa. Sthena, whose name can mean strong or mighty, Uriel, possibly far-spinning or wide-leaping, and Medusa, whose name means guardian or protector. That's worth pausing on, because in the earliest versions, her name doesn't suggest a predator or a curse. It suggests a role, one connected to the Gorgonian face, meant to keep bad things away. Now, in Hesiod's account, two of the sisters are mortal, Sthena and Uriel. Medusa is not. That single detail sets her apart. In a world where gods and monsters could endure forever, to be mortal meant limits. It meant vulnerability, but also change. the kind of change that would become central to her later story. Hesiod also locates them beyond the famed ocean, at the edge of the world, near the night-dwelling Hesperides. This is important. The edge of the world wasn't just a poetic image. To the Greeks of Hesiod's time, there really was a known world, the Mediterranean and parts of the Black Sea. And then there were places beyond, hinted at by sailors' tales, but not mapped. The edges were where they placed things that didn't belong to the safe everyday order. By setting the Gorgons there, Hesiod keeps them both real and unreachable. From an archaeological perspective, it's interesting how this matches the way the Gorgon image appears in art. On early temple pediments, like the one from the Temple of Artemis on Corfu, the Gorgon is shown in a running pose, knees bent like a sprinter, wings at her sides, wide eyes staring out. Flanking her are big cats, a visual sign of ferocity. She's not yet a tragic beauty. She's a powerful guardian, placed right at the threshold of a sacred building to protect it. This lines up with the protector meaning of Medusa's name. The ancient viewer standing before that temple wouldn't have thought of her as a woman wronged. They'd have thought, this is the face that keeps the unworthy away from the goddess inside. We can also compare Hesiod's version to another early poet, Pindar, who lived a bit later. He adds that Medusa was killed by Perseus while she slept, a detail that will echo in later tellings. But in Pindar's time, there's still no mention of how she came to look the way she did. That part, the Temple of Athena, the sea god Poseidon, the transformation, comes much later, through Roman literature, especially Ovid. For now, in Hesiodic world, Medusa simply is what she is, a mortal Gorgon, dwelling at the world's edge, sister to immortals, already carrying the power of her gaze. And that's another important point. In the earliest accounts, there's no origin story for the petrifying stare. It's simply part of her being. She doesn't have to gain it. She has it from the start. When archaeologists and historians look at these early layers, they often separate them from the later tragic victim narrative. Not because one is truer than the other, but because they serve different purposes. The archaic Medusa is almost like a force of nature, a thing you can't bargain with, only avoid or confront. She's part of the architecture of the mythic world, like Cerberus at the gates of the underworld, or the Hydra guarding a swamp. It's worth remembering that this was a time before myths were fixed in books for mass audiences. These stories were shared in songs, in public recitations, and in images painted or carved where everyone could see them. That's why the same figure could shift so much over the centuries. One poet could emphasize her as a terrifying obstacle to a hero's quest. Another could turn her into a warning about divine justice. And eventually, someone could make her into a woman with a history you could almost touch. The archaeological records gives us snapshots of those shifts. The early pottery and temple carvings show a creature meant to intimidate. By the classical period, you start seeing Gorgons with more human features, still fierce, but less grotesque. And by the Hellenistic period, in the last few centuries before the Common Era, she can appear almost serene. That's the Medusa whose face might have been carved into jewelry, worn close to the body as both ornament and amulet. So here, at this early stage in the story, we have a figure already layered, a sea-born child of ancient deities, one mortal sister among immortals, a protector at the edge of the world, a face used to guard sacred spaces. This is the foundation on which every later version will build. And knowing it matters, because when we get to Roman retelling, with all its detail about Athena's temple and Poseidon's intrusion, we'll see just how far the story travels from its starting point. But before we jump forward in time, we need to understand what it meant to be at the edge of the world in the Greek imagination, and how that setting shaped the kind of life or isolation the Gorgon might have had. That's where we'll go next. Chapter 3: At the Edge of the World. In Hesiod's account, the Gorgons live beyond famed ocean, which to the Greeks meant not just far away, but outside the map of ordinary life. To understand why that matters, we need to step into their way of seeing the world. The ancient Greeks didn't imagine the earth as a globe with oceans and continents like we do today. They pictured the land they knew, the Mediterranean basin and parts of the Black Sea, as a kind of disk surrounded by a vast encircling river called Oceanus. Beyond Oceanus lay places both mysterious and dangerous, the homes of night-dwelling spirits, the gardens of Hesperides, the stream of the river Styx, the entrance to the underworld. In this imagined geography, the edge of the world wasn't a cliff you could sail over. It was a boundary between what was known and what was entirely other. You placed there the kinds of beings you weren't likely to meet in a marketplace or a port. And by putting the Gorgons beyond that line, Hesiod signals that they are part of the raw, untamed architecture of the cosmos. It's worth noting that this placement also fits the archaeological pattern for certain cult sites. In later Greek and Roman religion, shrines to boundary spirits, guardians, or protective forces often sat at literal edges, at city gates or on the frontiers of inhabited land. We can't prove that there was ever a real-world Gorgon shrine at the edge of the Greek world in Hesiod's time. But centuries later, the discovery of a carved Gorgonian in Garm's cave in Gibraltar stirred speculation. The cave is perched above the sea at what would have been for ancient Mediterranean sailors nearly the farthest west you could go before hitting the Atlantic. Was it a shrine? Or was it a sailor's offering? We don't know. but the location matches the mythic instinct to put the Gorgon at the limit of the familiar. Imagine what life might have been like in such a place. The edge wasn't busy farmland or a bustling city. It was a zone of transition. Wild coastlines, rocky ground, harsh winds. The Greeks often imagined these liminal places as both lonely and dangerous. To dwell there was to live in a space where few would come willingly. For the Gorgons, that isolation might have been both a protection and a prison. No one comes to your door with petty disputes. No armies march across your land, but also no neighbors to share the harvest, no festivals to attend, no market stalls filled with figs and honey. In this way, the edge becomes a setting that makes sense for beings who are part of the divine order, but not integrated into human life. In early art, the Gorgons are shown as winged, able to move across these vast inhospitable spaces quickly. The wings may not have been meant literally. In Greek art, wings often marked a being as supernatural, able to cross between realms, but they add to the sense that the Gorgons could move between worlds, from their remote dwelling to the places where they were needed, whether to guard something or to confront someone. Now, here's where the mortal nature of Medusa becomes important again. If her sisters could endure forever, they could afford to live at the edge with no fear of change. Medusa could not. Time touched her. Hunger, injury, the slow wear of years, all those things that mortal bodies know, would still have been hers. And perhaps, in the way of myths, that vulnerability made her a target for a hero's quest later on. Before we get to that hero though, it's useful to see how Greek myth often treats the edge as a stage for transformation. Many figures who live in remote places are eventually drawn into contact with the human world, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. A hero might travel there to seek a gift or a secret. A god might send someone there as a punishment or a test. And sometimes a mortal might be pushed there by exile or escape, finding that the only way to survive is to live outside the reach of ordinary society. When we bring all this back to Medusa, we can see how her later, more personal story might have grown out of these early images. If she begins as a guardian figure on the edge, her transformation into a woman driven away from the center of life into exile isn't a complete invention. It's a humanized retelling of the same placement. In both versions, she ends up far from the world of cities and temples. In both, she is marked as dangerous to approach. And in both, her isolation is a defining part of her identity. Archaeologists have noted that in Greek thought, edges were often places where the rules bent or broke. The gods could act more freely there, without the same kinds of ritual checks that temples in the city imposed. That makes the edge a fitting place for a story about a god breaking a temple's rules. a detail we'll encounter when we reach Ovid's account. It also means that when a hero like Perseus goes to the edge, he's crossing into a space where normal protections don't apply, and where what he does there won't be judged the same way it would in the city square. So the edge of the world is more than a setting. It's a symbolic location that shapes the kind of story Medusa can have. It explains why she's hard to reach, why few have seen her and lived, and why when Perseus returns with her head, it carries such weight. He has brought back something from the place where mortals do not belong. As we step toward the next chapter, keep that picture in your mind. A rocky coast beyond the maps most people know. The sound of wind through stone arches. A cave mouth dug inside the sea. And somewhere inside, a figure who's part of the order of things, yet cut off from the world that order protects. That is the Medusa we inherit from the earliest layers, remote, formidable, set apart. In the next chapter, we'll watch how the Roman poet Ovid reshapes her into someone else entirely. A temple servant, a victim of divine violation, and a figure punished not for what she did, but for what was done to her. Chapter 4: The Transformation. By the time we reach the Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BCE, Medusa's story has changed. In his Metamorphosis, she's no longer simply a guardian creature living beyond Oceanus. She is a woman, mortal, beautiful, and serving in a temple dedicated to Athena. And it is here in Ovid's hands that we get the first clear explanation for her transformation. Ovid writes in a flowing narrative style, full of detail and emotion. He tells us that Medusa's beauty was famous, but it was her hair, long, shining, unlike anyone else's, that drew the most attention. This detail matters, because in the transformation that follows, that hair will be the focus of the change. The Temple of Athena in Ovid's story is a sacred space, and this is more than just a statement of religion. In both Greek and Roman worlds, the sanctuary was inviolable. To harm someone inside it was to commit not just a crime, but a sacrilege, an offense against the god or goddess whose house it was. For the Greeks, temples were cleansed and purified regularly. For the Romans, they were also protected by law. In Ovid's version, Poseidon, the god of the sea, called Neptune by the Romans, sees Medusa, desires her, and comes to her in the temple. What happens next is described only briefly, but the implication is clear. He takes her against her will. Ovid doesn't soften the fact that this is violence. He also doesn't spend long on the act itself. Instead, he moves quickly to the consequence, not for Poseidon, but for Medusa. This is where the story takes on its cruel shape. Athena returns to her temple, sees what has happened, and is enraged. But instead of punishing Poseidon, a fellow Olympian her equal in divine rank, she punishes Medusa. Their reasoning is left unsaid, but ancient audiences would have understood the logic of power. Gods were almost never held to account by other gods, especially for acts committed against mortals. A mortal could be punished, exiled, or transformed, but a god rarely, if ever. And so, Athena's response is transformation. She takes the beauty that drew Poseidon's gaze, the hair that Ovid made sure to describe, and changes it. In place of each strand, a serpent. The scalp alive with hissing, coiling snakes. The kind of change that is both a curse and a warning. In Ovid's telling, Athena also gives Medusa a new kind of gaze, one so terrible that anyone who looks directly into her eyes turns to stone. The myth doesn't say whether this power comes from Athena's will or from some deeper magic of the transformation. Either way, the effect is the same. Medusa becomes untouchable. No one can meet her gaze and survive. From a cultural perspective, this part of the story has drawn much discussion over the centuries. Why punish the victim? Some historians point to the way ancient societies placed heavy emphasis on ritual purity. And in that framework, even being the target of violence in a temple could be seen as defiling the space, no matter the victim's lack of guilt. Others see it as a reflection of how myth often shields the gods from blame, shifting the cost of their actions onto mortals. For Medusa herself, the change is total. She is no longer a mortal priestess who could move among people. She becomes dangerous to look at, dangerous to be near. The temple is no longer her home. She is forced to leave. This part of the myth echoes another ancient pattern: exile after transformation. Those turned into monsters or magical beings often end up in remote places, separated from human life. It's worth pausing here to think about the visual impact of the transformation in Ovid's world. Roman artists, like the Greeks before them, knew the Gorgonion, the Gorgon face, as a symbol. But in Ovid's version, the symbol now has a backstory. Every carving of that face, every image on a shield, could be linked to this moment in the temple. And perhaps, for Roman audiences, that added a layer of pathos. The face was not always monstrous. It had once belonged to a woman who served a goddess. The snakes themselves would have carried meanings for Ovid's readers. In the ancient Mediterranean, snakes were often linked to both danger and protection. They appeared on the staffs of healing gods, like Asclepius, but also in the hair of protective spirits on buildings. To turn hair into snakes was to merge beauty with menace, to make the admired into the feared. When Ovid describes the transformation, he keeps it simple, almost clinical. There's no long scene of Medusa begging or Athena announcing her curse. It's quick, decisive, and final. The brevity may be part of the cruelty. It's over in a few lines, and Medusa's old life is gone. After this, Ovid moves on to Perseus, the hero who will later confront her. But for us, staying with Medusa a little longer helps to see the human cost. A priestess loses her role, her home, her community. A mortal woman gains a power that isolates her completely, and the goddess she served becomes the one who carries her face, now a weapon on her shield. From here on, Medusa lives outside the center of the world. She has become, in mythic terms, an other, a being whose existence is defined by danger and distance. But unlike the early Hesiodic Gorgon, this other has a personal story, a moment of injustice at its heart. That shift is Ovid's lasting contribution to the myth. In the next chapter, we'll follow her to that exile, the cave by the sea, the land beyond roads, and see how later traditions imagined her life there, alone with her snakes and her thoughts, until the day a hero comes with a mirrored shield. Chapter 5: Exile to the Far Shore. After the temple, the story steps away from crowds and marble. Medusa lives the center of life. No city, no market, no festival days. Just a long way out. The kind of journey people take when they're not really traveling to somewhere. They're traveling away from something they can't return to. Ancient audiences didn't need every mile described. Exile told them enough. It meant food would be harder to find and friendships rarer. In Greece, exile stripped a person of the things that made life steady: the city's protection, family support, regular worship. For Medusa, exile adds something heavier. She is dangerous to look at, so there's no good farewell, no final embrace. She goes alone, and anyone who tries to go with her risks becoming a statue on the path. Picture a coast no one claims, not the bright blue shores on postcards, a harsher reach of stone and scrub, salt carried on the wind, low bushes bending the same direction year after year, a handful of birds that nest in cliffs because nothing else wants to live that near the spray. There's a cave, mouth dark in the rock, wide enough to shelter a person, deep enough to feel like night even at noon. That is where she stops. Caves in the ancient world were not just holes in stone. Many were treated as natural shrines. People left offerings in them to nymphs and river spirits. They hid in them during storms. They stored grain there when the air outside ran too hot. For Medusa, a cave is also a practical choice. Shade, steady temperatures, a wall at her back, and a view of the one approach anyone can take to reach her. She doesn't need a good house. She needs a place where surprises are few. Now think about ordinary needs. Water, food, warmth. The cave gives coolness and shelter, but not water. She would have to find a spring or collect rain where it runs down grooves in the cliff. Food means shellfish, fish, if she can set a line from a protected ledge, birds' eggs in season, bitter greens that grow in cracks. There's no farming here. There's foraging and patience. The sea gives, but not on command. At first she will move like someone who is used to others, lighting lamps in a certain order, laying out her sleeping space neatly. Those habits stay, even when they stop being necessary. Then new habits replace them. She learns how to read the wind through the entrance, which weather keeps the surf high, which brings quiet. She times her steps along the ledge with the waves, so the spray won't send her sliding. She maps the rock under her bare feet, until she could find her way in darkness. She probably talks less, not because silence is noble, but because there's no one to talk to who can answer without turning to stone. That snakes in her hair? We don't need to imagine them as wild or theatrical. It's simpler than that. Sometimes they're restless. A hiss when a gull shadows the mouth of the cave. A rustle when the air changes. A low coil when she falls asleep. Sometimes they're still, like ropes drying on a dock. They are part of her now, as plain as breath. They make other creatures wary, and they save her from some dangers. A bull won't charge what it doesn't understand. A thief who wanders too close doesn't remain a thief for long. And so the statues begin. Not many at first. A hunter who thinks an easy shelter might hold game. A bandit who imagines nothing worse than a hermit lives in a cave. A sailor whose small boat breaks on the rocks, who stumbles in seeking help. They arrive at open eyes and stop where they stand, one hand lifted, a knee half bent, a mouth just about to form a word that never leaves it. Their faces keep the last thing they felt, surprise, fear, that tiny flicker of apology that comes too late. Ancient listeners would not have asked for a count. A few are enough. They stand in the light just inside the entrance, where spray dampens their stone and the salt lives across. They are not trophies. They are the cost of getting near her. Over time, they become markers. The wind hits harder there. The tide reaches to that one's knee. Birds nest in the crook of that one's arms. She learns the silhouettes by heart and moves between them without looking up. Sometimes she thinks about turning away first, calling out a warning and facing the wall until footsteps sound safely past. But warnings mean words, and words mean someone needs to be close enough to hear them. In this place, closeness is not kindness. Distance is the only mercy she can manage. The days start to separate into kinds. Days the sea is loud, and days the sea is small. On loud days, she stays in, lights an oil lamp if she has oil, listens to the steady thud of water against stone. On small sea days, she works the ledges, sets lines, gathers limpets and mussels, checks the small catches where she leaves driftwood to dry. She keeps a rhythm, because rhythm keeps people well when no one is watching. You can imagine her clothing changing too. The temple's neat ropes give way to layers a person can walk and climb in. A belt holds a knife, a small pouch for a flint, and a bit of twine. Maybe a charm kept from her old life. Not because she believes it will save her, but because it reminds her she once had a name, said softly by others. Once in a while, she looks inland. There's a line where the rough ground rises and then flattens into the far land where people live. The human world is near enough to picture and far enough to feel like a story told long ago. She could move farther inland, but the sea is better, fewer paths cross it, fewer chances of meeting eyes she cannot protect. It's worth saying out loud what the myth implies quietly. The power that keeps others away also keeps them from hurting her. No soldier can take her. No mob can drag her back to the city for punishment. No passing traveler can decide what she owes. In a world where laws bend easily for the strong, her gaze is a law even the strong cannot bargain with. That doesn't make her happy. It makes her safe. Safety is not the same as comfort, but for an exile, it matters more. The story of Perseus is already forming somewhere else at this time. A young man who will be handed tools and a task. But that threat hasn't reached her yet. In her cave, the days have the slow measure of real life lived at the edge. You mend what tears. You keep the fire from going out completely. You eat what you can find and thank the quiet for being kinder than a crowd. There are small, practical victories no poet bothered to list, but that keep a person going. Finding a pocket of fresh water that doesn't dry up in summer. Learning which cracks in the rock catch shellfish after storms. Discovering that dried seaweed burns if you twist it tightly and nurse it along. Making a hook from bone after the first metal one is lost. None of this is grand. All of it adds up to living. Do the statues frighten her? At first, probably. No one grows up ready to step around the shape of a person that will never move again. But fear dulls when it has no new tricks. In time, the figures at the entrance turn into part of the land, like the smooth boulder you always lean against, or the dip in the floor where water gathers. She keeps a respectful distance from the faces. She doesn't look into their eyes, not because they can do anything, they can't, but because it feels wrong to meet a gaze that never had a chance to look away. At night, the cave has two kinds of darkness, the kind you can see and the kind inside your chest. The first yields to a lamp. The second takes longer. People in isolation make their own company out of memories, tasks, and small sounds. Medusa listens to wind and surf, and the quick, dry slide of the snake's shifting when she changes position. She learns to sleep lightly and deeply, the way people do who must wake ready, but also must rest, or they stop being careful. It would be easier to tell the spot with sharp emotion. Grief that doesn't end, anger that eats everything it touches. But most long lives don't work like that. Feelings get folded into routines. Some days are heavy, some are lighter than you'd think. A clean morning after hard weather feels like a gift. A handful of berries found inland tastes better than it should. The body keeps going because it learns how. Sometimes word of her reaches the human world. Sailors talk. A shepherd sees something from a distance and describes it to a friend in town. Stories grow edges when they travel. A woman with snakes becomes a monster that eats men. By the time it reaches a wine shop in the next city, that's how heroes hear, not from the truth of a life, but from the shape a rumor takes when it's told at night. And yet, for all the talk that gathers out there, nothing changes in here. The same rungs of rock to climb, the same stretch of ledge to cross with care, the same sea that can sound kind at noon and merciless by dusk. Her exile is not a dramatic stage play. It's steady work with no witness. There is a thought that sometimes comes to people who live far from others. Maybe the world is easier to look at when it doesn't have to look back. For Medusa, that's literal. Her best view is outward. Water, sky, weather, birds. Anything that doesn't have a human face. She learns to read movement without meeting eyes. A person who approaches is identified by the angle of a shoulder, the lift of a knee, the way they carry their weight. She can turn aside before they come close if she gets enough warning. If not, the cave mouth gains another figure. We don't need to decide if she feels guilt for that. The myth doesn't ask us to judge her. It asks us to see how a power meant to protect Goddess's house becomes a power that protects its bearer by isolating her. The same face carved on shields to ward off harm now lives on a person who can't be harmed easily and who can't be touched at all. In time, and myths compress time without apology, a different kind of visitor approaches the coast. He doesn't come by chance. He has been sent. He carries things no ordinary traveler carries. A bright shield that shows the world like water does. Sandals that make rough ground short. A blade that holds an edge longer than it should. His name is Perseus, but that is the next chapter. For now, leave Medusa where she is, because that is where she has learned to live. At the far shore, in a cave that smells of stone and salt, with a line for fish, a lamp for dark, a mind that keeps itself steady by giving each day its work. The sea rises and falls. The wind changes and then changes back. The statues keep their silence. And Medusa, who began as a mortal with a place in a temple, keeps going. Still mortal, still thinking, and more alone than any priestess was meant to be. And that is where we'll leave Medusa for tonight. Alone on the edge of the world, her life reshaped by the gods, her gaze now a shield against every threat. In the next episode, we'll follow the hero who dares to seek her out, and see how their paths meet in the shadow of fate. Thank you for listening to the Lady Mythos. Sweet dreams and sleep tight. And when night falls again, I'll be here, waiting to tell you the rest. Until then, good night.